Well, welcome, guys. Glad you all are here with us tonight. If you are new with us, or if this is your first time here in a while, let me just bring you up to speed real quick. We are in week 16 out of 18 in a series through the book of Ecclesiastes. That's right. We are gluttons for punishment. We have spent 18 weeks in the book of Ecclesiastes. But it has been really, really good, right? We have explored a lot of things that we oftentimes just kind of skim over because we don't understand it, or it seems kind of boring, or maybe even a little irrelevant, and it certainly seems depressing, right? The book of Ecclesiastes, summed up in a sentence, is life is hard and then you die. And that's the gist of the entire book, right? But as we have dug into it over the last 16 weeks, we've actually learned that there's a whole lot more to it. That there are some very, very practical principles that we can take away from it, that it's a very relevant book to our lives. Even though it was written thousands of years ago, it makes a difference in how we live our lives here today. And tonight is going to be no exception to that. So we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 together. And in chapter 10 is kind of a weird break, just our chapter and verse sequences that we've added in after the fact. It's kind of an injustice here because he's really just continuing the thought that he had in chapter 9, which we talked about last week, where we learned that even tiny things can make a huge impact, right? One bad apple can ruin the entire barrel, right? We use that colloquialism that we use all the time. And so we're going to continue with that with another one in these first couple of verses. I'm just going to read the first three. Dead flies make a perfumer's oil ferment and stink. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise person's heart goes to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. And even when the fool walks along the road, his heart lacks sense, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. So a fly in the ointment, right? That's another phrase that we have heard, and it's going to make the perfume stink. No one likes the smell of dead bugs, right? There aren't any celebrities lining up to endorse essence of dead bugs and make really bizarre commercials out of them. Why are all perfume commercials so bizarre? I don't understand it, but that's another topic. But the point is not necessarily how bad the fly makes it stink. The point is something seemingly as insignificant as a fly or a gnat, or we might say a flea, just some kind of little bug can actually ruin something that's so good. And we actually experienced this at dinner the other night. We went out to dinner with the Dunaways, and Hannah picks up her glass and she starts to take a drink and notices that there is a fly in her drink. And she'd only had it was still only this far from the top. It was still a full glass. And she wouldn't touch it after that, right? How many of us would? How many of you, let me see your hands. How many of you, if you were in a restaurant and you picked up your glass and there was a dead fly in your drink, how many of you would just scoop that fly out and then go ahead and drink it? Anyone? Danny and Max are the only two who would do that. Wow, okay. So, but most of us wouldn't, right? Because, it's insignificant. It's just this tiny little speck. Just move it out of the way and drink it. And we're all like, no, I know better than that. That one little fly ruined that entire drink. The point here is that God is using something like bugs to make a principle, to identify a principle for us about life in general. The great American investor Warren Buffett says that it takes 20 years to build a reputation that can be destroyed in 5 minutes. And when you think about that, you do things differently. And that's what I think Ecclesiastes 10 is trying to help us get at. That we need to be thinking about how quickly and how a decision that's maybe seemingly insignificant can destroy years of good work that you have put in. One bad decision is all it takes to burn what you have built to the ground. Now, Ecclesiastes chapter 10 is a collection of proverbs, and there's a lot of different opinions about the nature of this chapter and how we're supposed to understand it. It's a pretty difficult passage to make sense of. I read probably 8 or 10 different commentators on this passage, and no one of them, or no two of them, agreed completely on the meaning of everything in this chapter. It's that ambiguous, it's that diverse, and I think that's on purpose, honestly. Like much of the wisdom literature, it's not designed to be a list of concrete rules that we're supposed to follow like lemmings. It's designed to make us think. It's designed to make us question and to pause long enough to consider the validity of what they're saying and how it might apply to our lives. And it's teaching us not just what is right, but it's teaching us how to chase after wisdom. And so I think some of the ambiguity in this, when you just read this passage, you're like, I have no idea what they're talking about. That's on purpose, because God wants us to stop long enough to really evaluate it and consider what it is that we are supposed to be thinking it through here. And I want to try and show a way in which where some of these proverbs seem like they aren't connected at all, and they may not be. Like much of the second half of the book of Proverbs itself, you may have a chapter with like 10 verses in it, and none of the 10 verses connect to any of the others, right? It's just like this collection of tidbits of wisdom put together. And there might be some of that happening here in chapter 10, but I do think there's a way in which to help us kind of wrap our minds around what the teacher wants us to hear, that we can understand all of this collection of bits of wisdom in a more comprehensive way. Because it only takes a little bit of bad to ruin something good. Here are 5 lessons that we can take away from this chapter that you can apply to your lives to help you apply wisdom and minimize those little mistakes that we make in life that can have major consequences. So I'm going to walk through all 5 of these for us here relatively quickly. Number 1, respond with calmness to idiots in authority. Man, this one is, how many of you have ever had an idiot boss? Most all of us. Ian better not raise his hand. Maybe previously. But, we all have worked for someone or we've seen people in places of authority, and he begins his little collection of practical pieces of advice by saying, listen, when your boss gets mad at you, when that person in authority over you gets mad at you, don't run and hide. Like the best thing you can do is to lower your head, keep doing your job, keep doing what your responsibilities call for you to do, and respond in calmness. That is ultimately going to give you the best shot at success in life. If we don't respond irrationally or out of anger, if we keep our calm composure, even in very aggravating situations, even when the person in authority over us is acting like a complete fool, calmness is going to win the day. And the truth is, there are a lot of people who get these higher stations in life that we look at and we go, they don't deserve that job. Right? We all have seen someone who is in a role, they're in a position, and you're like, how in the world did they get that job? They have to know somebody, right? Or they've got dirt on somebody. There's some reason they have this, because they're not competent enough to do it. They're not friendly enough to get along with the people that work around them or work for them. There's some reason why this person has this job. They don't deserve it. Right? We all think that. So we feel that injustice. And the teacher here says that this is an evil that he's noticed, that sometimes it is the fools who get those high places of status. And the world does seem to operate. This goes right along with what he's been saying for the last 9 chapters, that sometimes the world just operates upside down. Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, and we can't understand it. We can't make sense of it. We don't know why it works that way, but that's just kind of how things go. Sometimes, as he says in one of these verses, that slaves ride on horses while princes walk as slaves. Right? Sometimes things are just backwards from how we think they ought to be. And people who we look at and go, this person is a complete fool. How do they have this position of authority? And it doesn't make sense to us. And I think this is particularly true, and a lot of what he's getting at here is in that political realm. Right? I think it was Mark Twain who said, imagine that you're an idiot. And now imagine that you're also in Congress, but I'm repeating myself. Right? Like that's kind of how I feel too when I look at some of our politicians and the things that they say and the responses that they give to things and how they behave. I'm like, this is complete lunacy. How in the world does this person have this place of authority in the world? It just doesn't make sense. But even at a more personal level, we think kind of the same things about people in authority over our lives more directly. When we see a supervisor who is acting foolishly, it becomes very challenging for us to fall in line, doesn't it? When we know our boss is wrong, we know they're acting like a moron. We can't really tell them that if we want to keep our jobs, but it becomes really hard to do our best and to do the work that we have set in front of us. But Ecclesiastes tells us that wisdom says that when we are faced with these kinds of situations, the best way to respond to it is with calmness and composure. Secondly, verses 8 through 11, he gives us a range of examples here of practical vocations that are full of dangerous situations. And here's our principle: avoid foolish risks in your daily tasks. Avoid foolish risks in your daily tasks. You know, those people who work in lumber yards, sometimes they get hurt. Those people who dig rock quarries, sometimes a rock falls on them. People who chop down trees, sometimes those trees fall on their house. I love watching those videos. You know, have you ever watched those where they're chopping down the tree and they think it's going to fall one way and then it falls the other way and goes right through their garage? I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it's still funny to watch. I'm just going to say. But the point here is that wisdom and folly is often the difference between all of these vocations. Yeah, sometimes bad things are going to happen when you're on the job site, right? And a lot of times we can mitigate those kinds of things by acting wisely. Little foolish decisions when you're digging a hole could lead to you falling into that hole. That's the principle that he is getting at. Foolish actions, even really small ones, oftentimes lead to unintended and harmful consequences. Therefore, we ought to think intentionally and carefully about our actions and their potential outcomes. We need to avoid unnecessary risk. When we aren't stopping long enough to think wisely about our actions, about our decisions, about the choices that we're making, we are opening the door to more foolish risks. However, we ought not to let the fear of making a mistake paralyze us from doing the work that we're supposed to do. Yeah, we want to avoid foolish risks, but that doesn't mean we need to avoid risk entirely. That's the whole point of verse 10. Verse 10, he reminds us to sharpen our axe. Because if you try and chop something down with a dull axe, you're going to get worn out, right? You need a sharp axe to do it. So plan, prepare, take the appropriate precautions and preparations needed to do your job well. And if you put in that effort, and if you pause long enough to think wisely about the decisions that you are making, you will avoid, in general, a lot of the foolish mistakes that lead to harm and pain. And it's going to save you a lot of time and energy. And it's also important that we act in a timely manner, too. That's what verse 11 is getting at with the snake charmer, right? How many of you before reading this knew that snake charmers were in the Bible? They are right here. The job of a snake charmer was to calm a snake so that it could be controlled. And he says, well, what good is a snake charmer if the snake has already bit someone? Not much, right? So act in the appropriate amount of time. Act when you are supposed to. Do your job, do it well, do it on time, do what you should be doing. This is the way of wisdom. And when you behave in that manner, you're going to avoid a lot of the foolish mistakes. So don't delay simply because you don't want to make a mistake. There's no advantage to be gained in that thought process either. Number 3, we're going to shift now from the things that you do to the things that you say. Now, it only takes a little bit of bad to ruin something good, right? That's probably nowhere more evident than with our words, right? Our mouths can get us into a lot of trouble, right? Let's read verses 12 through 14 together here. Verse 12 says, "The words from the mouth of a wise person are gracious, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words from his mouth is folly, but the end of his speaking is evil madness. Yet the fool multiplies words. No one knows what will happen, and who can tell anyone what will happen after him?" Isn't it funny how you can usually tell when someone's a fool because they never stop running their mouth? And when we're talking to people that don't stop running their mouth, have you ever called them on something and are like, "Hey, I don't think that's quite right," and then you just watch how they just go into a tailspin and they start using more and more words and they try to backtrack and try to get out of it, and they're just making the situation that much worse on themselves, and you're like, "Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about, do you?" Right? We all have seen people do that. Several years ago, Whitney and I were in the car with someone, and we were driving down a road, and there was a store or a restaurant or something, and Whitney and I made a comment we thought this restaurant was right here, and the person we were with goes, "No, it's not here. It's over there on that side of town." Like, "No, I'm pretty sure it's right here." "No, it's absolutely not. There's no way it's right here." And then we get up to it, and sure enough, the store is right there. And rather than where wisdom would say, "Oh man, I must have been wrong about that," or my geography was off, or I'm just misremembering that. Rather than that, no. Well, they must have tore down the other building and built a building right here and put this store right here, because this is not where it was 2 weeks ago. Okay. Right? Foolishness. They just continue spewing completely illogical things, and it snowballs. It starts with just a simple statement, but then they multiply their words, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. Fools have a way of doing that. It makes me think of Proverbs 10:19 that says, "Sin is not ended by multiplying words," right? We ought to choose our words carefully. Aim to speak with grace and with wisdom and with love, understanding that the words that you choose have the ability to build up or tear down. And wisdom is usually going to err to the side of building up, right? Sometimes it is wise to use words that tear somebody down in a constructive way, that, "Hey, you're doing wrong. Here's how this is wrong. Here's how we're going to fix it. Here's how we want to help you grow and mature and stop doing that wrong thing that's hurting you or that's sinful or whatever," right? So there are allowances for that. But in general, talking about wisdom principles that we can apply generically to our lives, wisdom says use words cautiously. Number 4, he tells us to work hard to prevent neglect and decay. So let's press pause on the words in a minute. We're going to come back to that, but let's go back now to thinking about our actions. A fourth lesson that wisdom teaches us is simply to avoid laziness. Look at verse 15. "The struggles of the fool weary them, for they don't know how to go to the city." Now, this is one verse in this chapter that most commentators do agree on. There's almost unanimous agreement that what this verse means is incomprehensible. No one has a fat clue what he is talking about here. In fact, most commentators, they don't even venture a guess. They just say, "I don't know." They'll talk for pages and pages about most verses, and then they get to this one and they just go, "Don't know. Let's move on to the next verse," right? Because we don't really understand what he's getting at. Best guess here is that he's simply ridiculing the foolishness of someone, how they will spend so much of their time showing everybody how foolish they are, and they will get so caught up in their foolishness that they get so exhausted that they can't even walk into a city. Much in the way that a drunk stumbles his way home at 4 a.m. and winds up at the wrong house because they are so intoxicated that they can't even figure out how to get home. The person who is foolish does the same thing. They are so foolish that they can't even figure out how to get where they're going. But then he kind of applies this to like a young king who likes to party first and then work later. And he says, I feel sorry for the land who has that kind of king. Because when you party first, you won't want to work later, right? You're not going to feel like doing work after that. And laziness is a symptom of foolishness. And the consequences of it lead to decay and dysfunction, both personally and in social contexts, I might add. Now, there's nothing wrong with feasting. That's a good thing, right? We ought to enjoy the things that God has given us. We ought to use what God has given us to celebrate and to have fun, but it needs to be done in the proper time. So approach your responsibilities with the right understanding of the order in which we ought to do that. We ought to approach things with diligence and with competence. We ought to work hard and avoid laziness and neglect that leads to deterioration. Verse 18 says that it's because of laziness that the roof caves in. Laziness is content to feast while the room that you're in is leaking. It has a misunderstanding of our priorities and what we ought to be focused on. Foolishness is spending money to give the appearance of a happy life while your primary responsibilities go unfulfilled. And the things around you that matter or that should matter start to decay. And I think that kind of goes back to verse 3 when he says that the fool shows everyone that he is a fool. Lazy people who won't put effort into the things that matter in life, they make a spectacle of themselves and they show everyone else around them, and it's plain to the rest of us that they are being foolish. But now let's look at the final verse of the chapter, verse 20. Do not curse the king even in your thoughts, and do not curse a rich person even in your bedroom. For a bird of the sky may carry the message, and a winged creature may report the matter. All right, so we're back to our words. And this is a very interesting verse. Don't curse the king because a winged creature might carry it off. We might say, a little birdie told me, right? A little birdie told me what you said. Now, the audience that the teacher is writing to here was a very different audience than us. So in our world here in the United States of America, we value, probably our biggest value is freedom of speech, right? And so every single one of us is free to criticize our political leaders. We could post about it on the internet for everyone to read. We could rent out stadiums and fill people full of it and tell them how much we think of our leaders, good or bad. We could spend millions of dollars on advertising to tell people how horrible our leaders are. We could do all of those things. And you may not agree with the view that's being espoused, but we do value that freedom to be able to offer that criticism, right? The world in which the people of Ecclesiastes lived had no such freedom. In their world, you criticize the king, it just might cost you your life. So he's cautioning them here, be very careful about what you say. Because even in secret, even in your bedroom with your closest confidants, the things that you say about your leader, about your king, just might somehow find their way back to that king. And then you're going to be in trouble. It's a foolish thing to do. So how are we supposed to apply that passage to us today, since it doesn't seem to fit in our cultural context? And I think one of the ways we do this, one of the obvious principles, and this is our fifth one here, and we're going to end with this: avoid speaking negatively about others. So avoid speaking negatively about others. And there are three reasons why I think wisdom dictates that we do this. Number one, the first one is a pragmatic reason, right? Even if you have this sense of confidence, in sharing your negative opinions about somebody with another person. You seldom can know with 100% certainty that person you're talking to isn't going to go and share what you said. Because, you may think, yeah, they're not going to say anything. But then what happens when you have a falling out with that person and there's no longer a loyalty or a need to keep that confidence? That little birdie can travel words back to the original person that you were talking about, right? So pragmatically, it's just not a wise thing to do, to talk negatively about someone to someone else. It's also a social wrong. We ought not to do that for a social reason, because most people are smart enough to know that if you're talking negatively to them about someone else, that you're probably talking negatively about them to someone else, right? We just know that's kind of, if people are talking bad about someone else, then that's just what we do. We talk bad about people. So that person's talking bad about them to me. Who's to say that they're not talking bad about me to them? So they're going to distance themselves from you, right? They're not going to be as open with you because they think you're the kind of person who's going to talk negatively about them to someone else. And shocker, no one likes to know that they're being talked bad about. So it's a social issue as well. But then the third reason that we ought not to do this is simply a character issue. There is no wisdom to be found in speaking negatively about others. Only in speaking negatively to the other. So rather than talking bad about someone to another party, if you have something negative to say, wisdom says, good character, integrity says, you talk to that person about whatever that negative issue is. And you still do so with love and with grace, right? Foolishness will have a place in your character if you're willing to talk to others about an issue, but not talk to that primary person. So Ecclesiastes is cautioning us, don't use negative talk. Don't talk negatively about others. Now, all of this is not to suggest that you should never say a negative word, right? We already mentioned that you're not free to talk about what's frustrating you, or that you shouldn't, take a stand, or that you shouldn't be vulnerable with someone else. It's none of that. We're simply applying this general principle of wisdom that prudence is essential for effective living. That we ought to be cautious when we speak, and in most cases, avoid speaking negatively about others. Verbal carelessness and indiscretion is going to lead you to a very unhappy place. And so wisdom tells us, don't do it. In fact, most situations that you find yourself in, there are ways of addressing that situation, of making your opinions and your thoughts known without resorting to talking negatively about someone else. So several years ago, when I worked at a church in another state, I had a boss who was an idiot. This person was everything I just talked about in the first part of this. They should not be in that position. They shouldn't have that role. They are incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. That was my boss. In fact, this boss was the reason that I went out and bought the book, How to Work for an Idiot, right? Like, I had to figure something out because this was just not a good environment, and this guy just was just not good. And I on a particular day, I found myself going to a meeting. It was about an hour drive away with my boss's boss. So it was just the two of us in the car, and we had a good long bit of windshield time. And he starts asking me questions about some of the things that were happening. And he gave me every opportunity. In fact, I'm still not convinced that he wasn't baiting me to get me to say negative things about my boss. But I wasn't going to do it. And every time he would ask me questions, and they kept getting more and more pointed in the questioning, but he kept asking these questions, and I would find ways to answer it without saying something negative. Hey, this guy's heart's in the right place. Or, I've seen this done the way he did it, and I've seen it done other ways. Personally, I prefer the outcome of this other way it's done. I've seen that work better. You find different ways to say this without speaking negatively about the person who is not there. And so our drive ended. All of that was fine. And about a month later, my boss's boss came to me and said, hey, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. I know there are issues here with this boss and the way he does things. And there's some issues I can't do anything about, but there's others that I can. And I want to offer you a promotion. I want to offer you this different job that would move you out from underneath this person. And here's why I want to do this. He said, you know what impressed me most about our conversation together? He said, it's what you didn't say. He said, I gave you every chance to talk negatively about him, and you never did it. Guys, that's how wisdom operates. Wisdom wants you to be cautious in the negative things that you say about others. There are ways to talk about things and issues without getting into a negativity battle with someone. So let that be an encouragement to you. And here's a quick recap of all 5 of these lessons. And then I'm going to stop talking and we are going to baptize somebody. But here is these 5 lessons. So respond with calmness to fools in authority. Avoid foolish risks in your daily tasks. Choose your words carefully. Work hard to prevent neglect and decay. And avoid speaking negatively about others. All right?